The year 1095 since the Nativity of Christ. Europe was frozen in anxious anticipation without even realizing it. The continent, fragmented into a patchwork quilt of feudal domains, was suffocating from its own contradictions. The air was electrified. In castles, barons sharpened their swords, preparing for endless internecine wars. In monasteries, monks transcribed ancient prophecies, and in every sign, be it a comet in the night sky or an unusually bloody sunset, they saw harbingers of the end times. In villages and towns, the common folk bent their backs under the yoke of unbearable taxes, diseases, and famine, and their only solace was faith, passionate, at times ecstatic, promising salvation in the world to come. It was an age of extremes, a world where everything was divided into black and white, holiness and sin, heaven and hell, Christ and Antichrist. These forces waged an eternal battle for the souls of men, and it seemed the battlefield was the earth itself. The Great Schism had already, for half a century, split the Christian world into East and West, turning a once unified church into two bitter rivals. In the Holy Land, in Jerusalem, things were amiss. For centuries, Christian pilgrims, risking their lives, had journeyed to the Holy Sepulchre to wash the sacred stones with their tears, but now new masters were in power there. The Seljuk Turks, warriors from the steppes whose faith was different and whose ways were harsh. Rumors, each more terrible than the last, spread throughout the Christian world, passed by word of mouth in marketplaces and taverns. They spoke of desecrated churches, of murdered and humiliated pilgrims, of the path to Christianity's greatest shrine being cut off. And so, in this thick, stale air of universal fear, hope, and fanaticism, at the center of the gathering storm stood a man. A figure woven from contradictions, insignificant and great, a saint and perhaps a madman. A man whose name would soon thunder across the continent, from the hovels of the poor to royal palaces. His name was Peter of Amiens. But history would remember him by another name, Peter the Hermit. No one yet knew that this unprepossessing-looking wandering preacher was destined to put a torch to the powder keg that Europe had become. He was neither king nor pope nor general, but his word, ignited by faith, would prove stronger than armies. He would become the voice of the voiceless, the hope of the desperate, and the catalyst for an event that would change the world forever, the First Crusade. This story is about him, about the man who led nations, about the prophet whose speeches turned into rivers of blood, about his path, his faith, his tragedy, and about how a single voice can shake the foundations of civilizations. Before the torch lit by Peter the Hermit could set fire to the souls of hundreds of thousands of people, it is necessary to understand how dry and flammable the kindling had become in the European house by the end of the 11th century. History is rarely moved by the efforts of a single individual. Great people who change the world more often become merely the last drop that makes the cup overflow, or the lens that focuses long-accumulated energy. To comprehend the phenomenon of the Crusades and Peter's role in them, we must take a deep dive into the world that produced him, a world of political intrigue, spiritual quests, and civilizational confrontation. The political map of Europe presented a chaotic and unstable spectacle. The idea of a unified empire, the shadow of ancient Rome, still hovered over the continent, embodied in the Holy Roman Empire. However, its emperor, Henry IV, was consumed by an exhausting struggle with the most powerful institution of the time, the papacy. This conflict, known as the investiture controversy, was not just a dispute over who had the right to appoint bishops, the emperor or the pope. It was a titanic struggle for supreme authority in the Christian world. Pope Gregory VII, and then his successor, Urban II, championed the idea of papal theocracy, the doctrine that spiritual power, emanating directly from God, is superior to any secular authority. The emperor, excommunicated, humiliated at Canossa but not broken, responded by appointing his own anti-popes and launching military campaigns against Rome. This struggle fractured the loyalty of the aristocracy in Germany and Italy, spawned endless wars, and created a power vacuum that was filled with anarchy. The Kingdom of France, the homeland of Peter the Hermit, was but a shadow of its future might. King Philip of the Capetian dynasty effectively controlled only a small territory around Paris and Orléans, known as the Royal Domain. The rest of the country was divided among powerful and virtually independent dukes and counts of Normandy, Aquitaine, Anjou, Champagne, and Toulouse. These feudal lords behaved like sovereign rulers, minting their own coins, waging their own wars, and were often far richer and stronger than their nominal suzerain, the king. For this class of knights, war was not just an occupation but a way of life, a profession, and the main source of income. However, their boundless energy, finding no external outlet, turned inward, tormenting France itself. Endless feudal strife, so-called private wars, ruined the peasants, hindered trade, and undermined any attempts at centralization. To this must be added powerful demographic and economic pressures. Thanks to the so-called medieval warm period, with its warmer temperatures and increased crop yields, the population of Europe had grown significantly over several centuries. But the land had not grown larger. The system of primogeniture, by which all holdings were inherited by the eldest son, created an entire stratum of landless younger sons in aristocratic families. These young, ambitious, and well-trained knights had no inheritance of their own. They became mercenaries and often simply robbers, further increasing internal instability. For them, the call to a campaign in the East was not only a spiritual feat, but also a unique social elevator, a chance to win land, wealth, and glory that they were deprived of at home. On top of this were direct blows of fate. The last decades of the 11th century were marked by a series of crop failures, famines, and epidemics. Chroniclers of the time, such as Sigebert of Gembloux, described with horror the years when the rain never stopped, causing widespread floods and crop failures. The famine was so severe that, according to rumors, it led to cannibalism. Famine was followed by disease, pestilence that wiped out entire villages. For the common person, whose life already hung by a thread, the earthly world increasingly resembled the antechamber of hell. In this light, the call to go to the distant but blessed Jerusalem, where milk and honey were said to flow, was not just a call to war. It was a promise of deliverance, an escape from a cursed world to a promised land. The Church, aware of this problem, tried to curb the knights' unruliness through movements known as the Peace of God, or Pax Dei, and the Truce of God, or Truga Dei. The Peace of God declared certain categories of people, such as clergy, women, and peasants, and places like churches and mills, to be under the Church's protection and forbidden to be attacked. The Truce of God forbade military actions on certain days of the week, usually from Wednesday evening to Monday morning, and during major church holidays. These measures had limited success, but they set an important precedent. The Church assumed the role of arbiter and peacemaker, and the idea of a just and unjust war began to form in people's minds. A war for the protection of the defenseless and at the behest of the Church began to seem like a godly endeavor. In southern Europe, on the Iberian Peninsula, its own holy war, the Reconquista, had been going on for several centuries. The Christian kingdoms of Castile, Leon, Aragon, and Portugal were slowly, step by step, reconquering from the Muslim emirates the lands seized by the Arabs in the 8th century. The Reconquista was a permanent military frontier that attracted knights from all over Europe, especially from France. Here, the concept of the soldier of Christ, fighting the infidels for faith and land, was forged. The experience of the Reconquista, its ideology and practice, undoubtedly became one of the precursors to the Crusades. But the most anxious gaze of Europeans was turned to the east. The Byzantine Empire, the direct heir of Rome, the bastion of Eastern Christianity, was experiencing one of the most severe crises in its history. In the year 1071, a quarter of a century before Peter's preaching, at the Battle of Massacres, the army of Emperor Romanos IV Diogenes was utterly routed by the Seljuk Turks under Sultan Alp Arslan. This defeat was a catastrophe, as Asia Minor, the heart of the empire, its main source of recruits and food, was left open to Turkic conquests. Nomadic tribes poured into Byzantine lands, devastating cities, slaughtering the population and turning flourishing provinces into pastures. By the 1090s, Byzantium had lost almost all of Anatolia. The Seljuks founded their own sultanate here with its capital at Nicaea, only a few days' journey from Constantinople itself. Emperor Alexios I, Komnenos, who ascended the throne in 1081, was an extraordinary ruler. A cunning diplomat, a talented military commander, and a reformer, he desperately tried to save the remnants of the empire. He fought off the Normans in the west and the Pechenegs in the north, but the main threat came from the east. Alexios understood that he could not cope on his own. He needed mercenaries, professional, well-armed warriors from Western Europe. And he turned for help to where it seemed logical to turn, to the head of the Western Christian world, the Pope. He asked for contingents of knights whom he was willing to pay generously. Alexios saw them as a tool for reclaiming lost provinces. He could not have imagined what an uncontrollable flood his appeal would unleash, and how his pragmatic request for help would be reinterpreted and transformed into something completely different. The Islamic world itself at this time was far from united. The golden age of the Abbasid Caliphate was long past. The great Seljuk Empire, created by conquerors, was itself beginning to fragment by the end of the 11th century. After the death of the powerful Sultan Malik Shah in 1092, his sons and generals began a fierce struggle for power. Tearing the state apart, in Syria and Palestine, feuding emirs of Damascus, Aleppo, and Mosul ruled. In Egypt and on parts of the Palestinian coast, the Shiite Fatimid dynasty held sway, and they were mortal enemies of the Sunni Seljuks. This political fragmentation and internal strife among the Muslims would become one of the key factors ensuring the initial success of the Crusaders. It was in this context that the situation of Christians and pilgrims in the Holy Land changed. Under previous Arab rulers, including the Fatimids, Christians, as people of the book, enjoyed relative tolerance. They paid a special tax, the jizya, but were generally free to practice their faith and visit holy sites. The conquest of the region by the Seljuk Turks, recent converts to Islam who were more militant and religiously zealous, worsened the situation. Although there was no direct ban on pilgrimage, the journey became much more dangerous. Pilgrims were robbed, exactions increased manifold, and there were cases of violence and desecration of holy sites. It was these stories, greatly exaggerated and embellished, that reached Europe, fanning anger and a thirst for revenge. In the year 1009, the Fatimid Caliph al-Hakim, known as the Mad, ordered the destruction of the Church of the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem, which sent a wave of shock and horror throughout the Christian world. Although the church was later rebuilt, the scar on the collective memory remained. And finally, the most important, deepest layer was the spiritual life and psychology of the medieval person. Life was short, full of hardship and danger. Death was a constant companion. The only anchor of salvation was faith. The idea of pilgrimage held a central place in this value system. A journey to holy places, to Rome, to Santiago de Compostela, and, as the ultimate goal, to Jerusalem, was considered the greatest spiritual feat. It was a form of penance, a way to atone for sins and earn a place in heaven. Pilgrims who returned from the Holy Land, bringing with them a palm branch and a particle of holy dust, were held in great esteem. The stories that this path was now closed or fraught with mortal humiliations were perceived as a personal insult, inflicted on every Christian and on Christ himself. Superimposed on this were widespread eschatological expectations. Many believed that the millennium since Christ's passion was approaching, and thus the second coming and the last judgment. According to popular prophecies, before the end of the world, a last emperor would appear who would crush the enemies of Christianity, liberate Jerusalem, and lay down his crown on Golgotha, after which the reign of the Antichrist would begin, followed by the final battle between good and evil. The liberation of Jerusalem in this context was not just a military enterprise, but a necessary act of sacred history, a step towards the fulfillment of the divine plan. It was into this world, pregnant with war, full of religious ecstasy, social contradictions, and apocalyptic fears, that Peter the Hermit was to step. He did not create these sentiments. He merely became their perfect expression, their voice. He gave an outlet to the accumulated energy, pointed it towards a goal and a direction. He transformed the vague aspirations, fears, and hopes of millions into a single devastating impulse. And while kings and popes wove the web of high politics, and the great powers of the time measured their strength in thousands of knightly lances in a quiet province, far from the splendor of capitals, a man was maturing who was destined to eclipse them all in the eyes of the common people. The story of his early years is shrouded in such a thick fog that it is almost impossible to separate truth from later legends created by both his admirers and his opponents. And this mystery only enhances his image, the image of a prophet who appeared as if from nowhere. His name was Peter, and he was from Amiens or its surroundings in Picardy, in northern France. Even his social origin is a matter of dispute. Some chroniclers, like Anna Komnen, the daughter of the Byzantine emperor, condescendingly call him Peter, Cuckoo Peter, and speak of his low birth. Others, notably Albert of Aachen, on the contrary, claim that he came from a noble family, was a vassal of the Count of Boulogne in his youth, a renowned warrior, but then, after an unhappy marriage, became disillusioned with worldly life and chose the path of a hermit. This version seems more attractive to the creators of a heroic epic, as a story of a noble knight who exchanged his sword for a cross. However, it is more likely that the truth, as is often the case, lies somewhere in the middle, or that the first version is closer to reality. His nickname, the Hermit, in French, l'ermite, indicates that he led an ascetic life, which was a fairly common phenomenon at the time. To understand who he was, one must imagine what it meant to be a hermit in 11th century Europe. It was not always a monk bound by the rule of a monastery. Often they were wandering preachers, charismatic ascetics who, of their own accord, withdrew from the world, lived on alms, wore simple clothes, and preached repentance and the gospel in a language understandable to the people. They stood outside the official church hierarchy and often enjoyed greater authority among the common folk than well-fed parish priests or noble bishops. Their way of life, their apparent holiness, and their fiery speeches found a lively response in the hearts of people who longed for spiritual sincerity. Peter, by all accounts, was just such a man. The chronicler Guibert of Nogent, his contemporary and countryman, has left us his most vivid verbal description. He paints a picture of a man of small stature, with a thin, emaciated face but with burning, piercing eyes. He walked barefoot, dressed in a simple, dirty woolen tunic, and ate neither bread nor meat, subsisting only on fish and wine. His constant companion was a donkey, which, according to Guibert, was held in no less reverence by the people than the preacher himself. People would pull hair from the donkey's tail and mane to keep as holy relics. Whatever he said or did, writes Guibert, seemed filled with divine grace. He possessed an incredible gift of persuasion. His word had such power that he could reconcile the bitterest enemies, and fallen women would publicly repent and return to virtue. Miracles were attributed to him. He was revered as a saint even during his lifetime. The key moment that became the starting point of his mission was his pilgrimage to Jerusalem. Here we enter the shaky ground of legend which, however, cannot be ignored, for it was the basis of his authority. According to this story, detailed by Albert of Aachen, Peter made a pilgrimage to the Holy Sepulchre even before the year 1095. There he saw with his own eyes the suffering and humiliation to which local Christians and pilgrims were subjected by the Turks. With a broken heart, he went to the elderly patriarch of Jerusalem, Simeon II. In tears, he asked the patriarch if there was no hope of help from Western Christians. The patriarch replied with a sigh that they were poor and weak and there was no help to be expected. He gave Peter a letter describing the calamities and pleading for help, addressed to the Pope and all the rulers of Europe. But the climax of this story comes at night. As Peter was praying in the Church of the Resurrection, he fell into a trance, and Jesus Christ himself appeared to him. The Savior addressed him with these words, "Arise, Peter, my valiant messenger. Hurry without delay to the Patriarch, take from him the letter he has given you. Go to the lands of the West, preach tirelessly of the calamities of this holy place, call upon princes and people to cleanse my holy sites. For I will open your mouth and put my wisdom into it. I will be with you and will cause a multitude of people to follow you." Upon awakening, Peter, filled with divine fire, set out. He crossed the sea, landed in Italy, appeared before Pope Urban II, showed him the Patriarch's letter and told of his vision. The Pope, having listened to him, allegedly decided to convene a council to proclaim a holy war. How true is this story? Modern historians treat it with great skepticism. Firstly, the earliest and most reliable chroniclers of the Crusades, such as Fulcher of Chartres, who was a direct participant, do not mention it. Secondly, the Byzantine princess Anna Komnena, who describes Peter's arrival in Constantinople in detail, claims that he had only attempted to make a pilgrimage, but the Turks did not let him pass and subjected him to abuse, after which he returned full of a thirst for revenge. Thirdly, the very idea that an unknown hermit inspired the Pope to such a large-scale enterprise seems unlikely. As we shall see, Urban II had his own, much more compelling and pragmatic reasons for organizing the crusade. Most likely, the legend of the vision in Jerusalem was created and spread later, perhaps by Peter himself or his followers, to give his mission a sacred, divinely chosen character. In the eyes of a medieval person, a direct commission from Christ was the strongest possible mandate, placing him above kings and even the Pope himself. But regardless of whether Peter had actually been to Jerusalem and had a vision, one thing is certain. By 1095, he was already a famous and influential preacher, deeply convinced of the need to liberate the Holy Land. His personal experience, real or imagined, his asceticism, and his incredible charisma made him the ideal mouthpiece for ideas that were already in the air. He did not invent the idea of a holy war, but he took this idea from the halls of papal palaces and carried it to the squares and roads of Europe, translating it from the language of high politics into the language of fervent faith, understandable to every peasant and artisan. He became the living embodiment of this idea. It seemed the world was frozen in a fragile balance. But beneath the surface, forces were maturing, ready to shatter this order, and soon thunder would strike not from the mouth of a lone ascetic, but from the height of the papal throne. The event that would become the official starting point of the Crusades era took place in the heart of France, in the city of Clermont. And its main protagonist was not Peter the Hermit, but a man of a completely different sort, Pope Urban II. Eudes de Châtillon, who went down in history as Urban II, was the complete opposite of Peter. An aristocrat by birth, brilliantly educated, he had gone through the stern school of the famous Cluny Abbey, the center of church reforms that advocated for the purification of clergy morals and the strengthening of papal power. He was the closest associate of the great reformer Pope Gregory VII, and had absorbed his ideas about the supremacy of Rome over all secular rulers. Becoming pope in 1088, Urban found himself in a most difficult position. In Rome itself, his rival, the anti-pope Clement III, supported by the German Emperor Henry IV, held sway. King Philip III of France was excommunicated for bigamy. King William II Rufus of England was also in sharp conflict with Rome. Urban's power was fragile, and he needed a grand project that could unite the divided Christian world around him, demonstrate his leadership, and raise the authority of the papacy to unprecedented heights. It was at this moment in March of 1095 at a council in the Italian city of Piacenza that envoys from the Byzantine Emperor Alexios I Komnenos appeared before Urban. They vividly described the dire situation of the Eastern Empire, spoke of the threat from the Seljuk Turks, and on behalf of their emperor pleaded with Western Christians for military aid. As we remember, Alexios asked for contingents of mercenaries. But in Urban's mind, this request was transformed into something completely different. He saw a unique opportunity in it. Firstly, a military expedition to the east under the auspices of the Pope would allow the aggressive energy of European knighthood, which was tormenting the continent, to be directed outwards. Instead of killing each other in internecine wars, the soldiers of Christ could turn their swords against the enemies of the faith. This was a brilliant implementation of the ideas of the peace of God on a continental scale. Secondly, by providing aid to Byzantium, Urban hoped for a rapprochement and possibly for overcoming the Great Schism of 1054. He dreamed of reuniting the churches under his supremacy, which would make him the spiritual leader of the entire Christian world, from the Atlantic to Antioch. Thirdly, the liberation of Jerusalem, the greatest of holy sites, was an incredibly powerful slogan, capable of inspiring people of all classes. It was a goal that placed the Pope who proclaimed it at the center of sacred history, making him God's vicar on earth, not in word but in deed. Fourthly, such a campaign would inevitably strengthen papal influence at the expense of the power of the emperor and kings. It was not the emperor but the Pope who was assembling and directing the greatest army in the history of the Christian world. For 8 months after the Council of Piacenza, Urban II traveled through Italy and France, preparing the ground for his great announcement. He held negotiations with influential lords and secured the support of bishops and abbots. And finally, in November 1095, he convened a major church council in Clermont, in the heart of France. November 27, 1095, became a turning point in history. On an open field near the eastern gates of the city, as no cathedral could hold all who wished to attend, a huge crowd gathered. Hundreds of bishops, abbots, and priests, many noble lords and knights, and countless common folk. In the center, on a high platform, sat Pope Urban II. And he began his speech, one of the most famous and fateful speeches in human history. We do not have its exact text, but several versions have come down to us, recorded by chroniclers who were either present or heard it recounted. Despite differences in detail, their essence is the same. Urban was a brilliant orator. He began by reminding the Franks, a people chosen and beloved by God, of their glorious ancestors of Charlemagne. Then he moved on to the main theme, the dire plight of their brothers in faith in the East. He painted terrifying pictures. From the confines of Jerusalem and from the city of Constantinople, a grave report has come to us, he said, according to the chronicler Fulcher of Chartres. A race from the kingdom of the Persians, an accursed race, a race utterly alienated from God, has invaded the lands of those Christians and has depopulated them by the sword, pillage, and fire. He spoke of destroyed churches, desecrated altars, of how the Turkish conquerors subjected Christians to excruciating tortures, led them into slavery, and forced them to renounce their faith. He appealed to their honor, to their duty. Then he addressed the knighthood directly. On whom, therefore, is the labor of avenging these wrongs and of recovering this territory incumbent, if not upon you? You upon whom, above all other nations, God has conferred remarkable glory in arms, great courage, bodily activity, and strength to humble the hairy scalp of those who resist you. Let the deeds of your ancestors move you and incite your minds to manly achievements. The glory and greatness of King Charlemagne. He contrasted their current shameful internecine wars where they tear and devour each other with a great and sacred goal. Let those who have been fighting against their brothers and relatives now fight in a proper way against the barbarians. Let those who have been serving as mercenaries for small pay now obtain the eternal reward. And finally, he offered them the greatest reward, not land and not gold, although that was implied. He offered them spiritual redemption. All who die by the way, whether by land or by sea or in battle against the pagans, shall have immediate remission of sins. This I grant them through the power of God with which I am invested. This was unheard of. Participation in the crusade was equated with full penance. The Church took upon itself the sins of those who went to fight for the Holy Sepulchre. Urban's speech had the effect of an exploding bomb, but this was only the culmination of a long and carefully prepared work. The Council of Clermont itself also dealt with many other purely ecclesiastical matters. It affirmed reforms, condemned simony or the sale of church offices, and once again excommunicated King Philip I of France. The proclamation of the crusade was the main, but not the only item on the agenda. After the council, the Pope did not let the matter rest. A whole propaganda machine was set in motion. Urban personally continued his journey through France, preaching in Limoges, Angers, and Tours. Special legates and bishops were sent to all corners of the Christian world to carry the papal appeal to every parish. They carried with them a standardized text of the address, ensuring a unified message. It is against the backdrop of this organized campaign that the spontaneous, fiery, and uncontrolled preaching of Peter the Hermit, who appealed not to reason but directly to the heart and soul, stands out. When the Pope finished, the crowd, seized by a single impulse of religious ecstasy, burst into a cry that would echo throughout Europe and become the battle cry of an entire era. Dieu le veult, Dieu le veult, which means, God wills it, God wills it. There and then, the Bishop of Le Puy, Adhemar of Monteil, knelt before the Pope and asked for permission to participate in the crusade. Urban immediately appointed him his legate and the spiritual leader of the expedition. Hundreds of other knights and clerics followed. People sewed crosses of red cloth onto their clothing, becoming crusaders, that is, those who bear the cross. The idea had taken on flesh and blood. The Council of Clermont also made specific organizational decisions. The departure date was set for the Feast of the Assumption, August 15, 1096, to allow time for preparations. The property of crusaders was declared to be under the protection of the Church for the duration of their absence. A clear goal was established: the city of Jerusalem. Pope Urban II had achieved his goal. He had set in motion a process that would go far beyond his initial plans. He had envisioned an organized campaign of a feudal host under the leadership of his legate. He could not have foreseen that his appeal, taken up by wandering preachers, would give rise to another popular wave that would surge eastwards much earlier. And at its head would be that same unprepossessing hermit from Picardy, Peter the Hermit. The official crusade of the princes and barons was still in preparation. But the flame had already been lit, and it began to spread with incredible speed. And while in the castles of Normandy, Provence, and Lorraine, powerful dukes and counts like Raymond of Toulouse, Godfrey of Bouillon, and Bohemond of Taranto were counting their forces, gathering provisions and forging weapons, preparing for the organized departure appointed by the Pope for August of 1096. Another, unforeseen and uncontrollable avalanche was already rolling across the roads of Europe. This was the response to Urban's call not from the nobility, but from those to whom he had not directly appealed, the common people. And the main catalyst that turned the papal decree into mass hysteria was Peter the Hermit. Immediately after the Council of Clermont, and perhaps even before it, Peter began his own grand preaching campaign. If Urban addressed the elite, Peter spoke to the crowd. He traveled through northern and central France, then moved into Lorraine and Germany, into the Rhineland. His appearance in any town or village caused a sensation. Riding his famous donkey barefoot in a dirty hair shirt, with a crucifix in his hand, he was the living embodiment of evangelical poverty and holiness. His eloquence, according to contemporaries, was hypnotic. He did not speak of geopolitics or the reunion of churches. He spoke of things understandable and close to everyone. He painted vivid, bloody pictures of the sufferings of Christians in the Holy Land, told perhaps in the first person, of the desecrated Holy Sepulchre, of flagellated pilgrims. He appealed not to knightly honor, but to the sense of Christian duty and the thirst for miracles. His preaching was aimed at those who had nothing to lose in this life, but hoped to gain everything in the next. He promised not just remission of sins, he promised immediate salvation. For peasants crushed by feudal oppression, for artisans suffering from hunger and poverty, for minor knights without land, his call sounded like a promise of exodus, an escape from a world of injustice to a promised land. Jerusalem in their imagination was not just an earthly city, it was becoming the heavenly city, where Christ himself awaited them. The effect was stunning. People abandoned everything, their homes, their fields, their families. They sold their meager possessions to buy some kind of weapon, a rusty sword, an axe, or just a club, and followed the prophet. A huge, motley, and completely unruly crowd began to gather around Peter. Historians call this movement the Peasants' Crusade or the People's Crusade. Who were these people? The core was made up of peasants from France and Germany, but they were joined by townspeople, impoverished knights who lacked the means to join the nobles' crusade. There were many women, children, and old people. This was not an army in the usual sense of the word, but a mass migration driven by religious ecstasy. They believed that their faith was their main weapon. They believed that the walls of Jericho fell to the sound of trumpets, and the walls of Jerusalem would fall before their prayers. They believed that God himself would part the sea for them, as he once did for Moses, and would crush their enemies. Soon Peter had associates and competitors, other preachers who gathered their own bands. The most famous of them was a poor Burgundian knight named Walter Sans Avoir, or Walter the Penniless. He gathered his own band of several thousand people and set out before Peter. In the spring of 1096, several months before the official start of the crusade, these disorganized crowds surged eastward. Walter the Penniless's vanguard moved first. Following him, in April, the main contingent under the leadership of Peter the Hermit himself, numbering by various estimates from 15,000 to 20,000 people, set out from Cologne. Their path lay through Germany, Hungary, Bulgaria, and Byzantine lands towards Constantinople. But as they moved through the Rhineland, another darker side of their religious zeal manifested itself in the ranks of the popular host. If they were to fight the enemies of Christ, some reasoned, why go to the ends of the earth when enemies live here, among us? They were referring to the Jewish communities that flourished in the trading cities on the Rhine, in Speyer, Worms, and Mainz. Fanatical preachers such as Count Amico of Leiningen, who claimed that the sign of the cross had miraculously appeared on his body, began to incite the crowd to massacre. Their logic was simple and terrifying. We are going to avenge the enemies of God at the ends of the earth, and here, right beside us, live the descendants of those who crucified him. Let us begin our vengeance with them. Horrific pogroms began, which went down in history as the Rhineland Massacres. The Crusaders of the poor burst into Jewish quarters offering a choice, baptism or death. They plundered and killed, sparing neither women nor children. Local bishops and city authorities such as Bishop John of Speyer or Rothard of Mainz were horrified by this savagery and tried to protect the Jews, hiding them in their palaces and cathedrals. But often they were powerless against the fury of the crazed mob, which besieged the episcopal residences, demanding their victims. Thousands of Jews were brutally murdered. Many, seeing the hopelessness of their situation, preferred death to forced baptism and committed mass suicide, killing their children and themselves. These tragic events became one of the darkest pages in the history of the First Crusade, and a harbinger of future centuries of European anti-Semitism. It is important to note that the main contingents, led by Peter the Hermit and Walter the Penniless, did not take a direct part in these bloodiest massacres, which were carried out by the German bands of Amico and other leaders. However, the atmosphere of hatred created by their preaching undoubtedly contributed to these excesses. The People's Crusade was doomed from the start. They had no discipline, no centralized command, and insufficient food supplies. They moved, devastating the areas they passed through, engaging in constant conflicts with the local population. Their path eastward became a trail of blood. The dream of the heavenly Jerusalem, which shone ahead, very soon collided with the harsh reality of the earthly journey. For the tens of thousands of Peter the Hermit's followers, the road to the east turned into a series of hardships, bloody clashes, and a loss of illusions. Their procession resembled not so much a pilgrimage as a natural disaster rolling across Europe. The first serious test was Hungary. Walter the Penniless's contingent, which went ahead, passed through Hungarian lands relatively peacefully, although not without minor incidents. But when Peter's main army reached the Hungarian border near the town of Semlin, now Zemun in Serbia, but then on the border of Hungary and Byzantium, the situation spun out of control. A dispute over the purchase of shoes flared into a full-scale battle. The Crusaders stormed Semlin, plundered it, and massacred several thousand inhabitants. This act of senseless cruelty turned King Clermont, the Learned, of Hungary against them. He moved his troops to meet the Pilgrims, and they had to flee, crossing the Sava River into Byzantine territory. Entering the lands of the Byzantine Empire brought no relief. The local population, mostly Orthodox Greeks and Slavs, looked upon these ragged, undisciplined, and aggressive Latins with horror and suspicion. To them, these were not liberators, but a wild horde. The logistics of their march were a nightmare. A huge crowd without baggage trains or centralized supply could survive only by plunder or begging. Anna Komnena, the emperor's daughter, wrote in her Alexiade that she saw the Celts moving forward with all their belongings and families, and their invasion resembled a river. She noted with surprise and contempt their unrestrained passion for gain and their frivolity. The Byzantine authorities, under orders from Emperor Alexios to escort the Crusaders and supply them with provisions, did what they could, but maintaining order in this mass was impossible. In Belgrade, which had been deserted after a Hungarian raid, the Crusaders started a fire. In Niš, the local Byzantine governor tried to provide them with food in exchange for hostages, but some of the German Crusaders again started fires, provoking an attack by the Byzantine garrison. Peter's contingent suffered serious losses and was scattered. Only with great difficulty did he manage to reassemble his people. Finally, on August 1st, 1096, exhausted, depleted, but still not broken in spirit, the crowds under the leadership of Peter the Hermit approached the walls of the greatest city in the Christian world, Constantinople. The sight that met their eyes must have stunned them. Majestic walls, golden domes of cathedrals, palaces, aqueducts. They had never seen anything like it in their villages and towns. But Emperor Alexios the Komnenos was no less stunned, seeing this disorganized and ragged army at his gates. These were not the professional knight mercenaries he had asked for. Alexios found himself in an extremely delicate position. He could not simply drive them away, for they were Christians who, they believed, had come at his call. But to leave this unstable mass under the walls of his capital was dangerous. He received Peter in the palace, listened to him, gave him money, and offered wise advice: to wait for the arrival of the main Crusader forces, the army of princes and barons. But Peter's followers did not want to wait. They behaved provocatively in the vicinity of the capital, plundering suburban villas and tearing lead from church roofs to melt down and sell. The emperor's patience was wearing thin. In the end, Alexios found what he thought was a brilliant solution. On August 6th, less than a week after their arrival, he ordered the Byzantine fleet to ferry Peter's entire army across the Bosphorus Strait into Asia Minor. Formally, he was bringing them closer to the goal of their crusade. In fact, he was simply getting rid of dangerous and troublesome guests, shifting the problem onto the shoulders of the Seljuk Turks. For the army of the poor, this was a fatal step. They found themselves in enemy territory, cut off from the capital by the sea, without support or supplies. Their camp was set up at a place called Civetot, or Civetotus in Latin, near the coast. Here, Peter the Hermit's authority, already shaken after the failures on the journey, began to rapidly decline. Discord broke out in the camp. The French and German contingents feuded with each other. Discipline completely collapsed. Instead of preparing for a march on Nicaea, the capital of the Seljuk Sultan Kilij Arslan I, the Crusaders engaged in plundering the surrounding Greek villages, making no distinction between Christians and Muslims. Peter, seeing that he had completely lost control of the situation, returned to Constantinople to ask the emperor for help and provisions. Perhaps this was a sign of prudence. Or perhaps, as his enemies claimed, simple desertion. Pride, impatience, and a complete lack of military skill sealed the tragic fate of the People's Crusade. Left in the camp at Civetot without their spiritual leader, the Crusaders finally split. The Germans and Italians, who made up about a third of the force, elected an Italian named Rhineland as their leader and decided to act independently, seeking glory and booty. In late September, a detachment of several thousand Germans marched into enemy territory and captured a small fortress called Zerigorden. They found rich supplies of food and wine there and gave themselves over to celebration. But they had fallen into a trap. Sultan Kilij Arslan I, who had initially paid little attention to these ragamuffins, now saw them as a real threat. He sent a significant force to Zerigorden. The Turks did not storm the fortress. They acted more cunningly. They blocked the only source of water, a well outside the fortress walls. The besieged Crusaders soon began to die of thirst. After 8 days of torment, Rhineland surrendered the fortress. Those who agreed to convert to Islam were spared and taken into slavery. Those who refused were mercilessly killed. When news of the fate of Zerigorden reached the main camp at Civetot, it caused not fear but envy and anger. A false rumor spread that the Germans had not only captured Zerigorden, but had also taken Nicaea itself and were now dividing untold treasures. The French majority, seized with greed, demanded an immediate march. More sensible leaders like Walter the Penniless urged them to wait for Peter's return. And news from the emperor, but no one listened. The crowd rushed forward, carrying everyone with them, including women, children, and the sick. On October 21st, 1096, a huge, disorganized mass of people left the camp and moved along the road towards Nicaea. They marched as a noisy, disorderly crowd without sending out scouts. And Kilij Arslan was already waiting for them. He had set an ambush in a wooded valley near the village of Drakon, just a few kilometers from Civetot. When the Crusaders entered the narrow valley, a shower of arrows rained down on them from all sides. Panic and slaughter began. Lacking armor and combat experience, the peasants were easy prey for the swift Turkic cavalry. Professional warriors, such as Walter the Penniless and other knights, tried to organize resistance but were swept away and fell in battle. The crowd fled in terror back towards the camp. The Turks pursued them, hacking and killing everyone without distinction. The slaughter was terrible. Only a few managed to take refuge in an old, dilapidated fortress on the seashore. The majority, however, including many women and children, were massacred right in the camp. By various estimates, from 15,000 to 25,000 people perished. The dream of a people's crusade had drowned in blood. Only a few thousand survivors were rescued by the Byzantine fleet, which arrived when it was all over. They, broken and demoralized, were ferried back to Constantinople. The catastrophe at Civetot became a terrible and sobering lesson. It clearly showed that faith alone, without weapons, discipline, and competent leadership, was not enough for victory. And what of Peter the Hermit? He learned of the destruction of his army while in Constantinople. It was a terrible blow for him. His mission, his great project, had ended in complete failure. He had lost everything: his army, his authority, his reputation as a prophet. From a leader of nations, he had turned into a pathetic failure, the head of a handful of surviving refugees. It seemed his historical role was over, but fate decreed otherwise. While the remnants of the army of the poor were licking their wounds in Constantinople, new forces were already appearing on the horizon. In the autumn of 1096 and the winter of 1097, the contingents of the real Crusaders, the Crusade of the Princes and Barons, the one sanctioned by Pope Urban, began to arrive at the Byzantine capital. These were well-armed professional armies led by the most powerful feudal lords of Europe. Among them were Godfrey of Bouillon, Duke of Lower Lorraine, and his brothers Baldwin and Eustace. Raymond IV, the powerful and wealthy Count of Toulouse, accompanied by the papal legate Adhemar of Monte, and the ambitious and cunning Norman Bohemond of Taranto, son of Byzantium's worst enemy Robert Guiscard and his nephew Tancred. Against the backdrop of these aristocrats shining in armor, surrounded by retinues of vassals, Peter the Hermit, with his handful of ragged followers, looked like a pathetic shadow. The prophet, whose name had recently thundered throughout Europe, had become a secondary, almost comical figure. The princes looked at him with poorly concealed contempt as the one responsible for the senseless deaths of thousands of people and as a man who had disgraced the very idea of a crusade. However, they could not completely disregard him. In the eyes of many common soldiers, he was still the man who had first raised the banner for the liberation of the Holy Sepulchre. He became a kind of living symbol, a talisman of the crusade. Peter and the remnants of his people joined the main Crusader army. Now he was not a leader, but rather a spiritual advisor whose role was reduced to giving sermons and maintaining morale. He made the entire long and difficult journey with the army of the princes. He was at the siege of Nicaea in May and June of 1097, where the Crusaders, having learned from bitter experience, acted much more cautiously and eventually forced the city to surrender to Emperor Alexios. He witnessed the great victory at the Battle of Dorylaeum on July 1st, 1097, where the combined Crusader forces defeated the army of that same Kilij Arslan who had destroyed the army of the poor. This was revenge and rehabilitation. But the most difficult and dramatic stage of the crusade, which became a severe test for Peter himself, was the siege of Antioch. The Crusaders besieged this huge, well-fortified city for almost 8 months, from October 1097 to June 1098. The siege was grueling. Famine and disease broke out in the Crusader camp. Morale plummeted. Many began to desert. And at this moment, in January 1098, Peter the Hermit committed an act that almost put a final end to his reputation. Unable to bear the hunger and hardships, he, the prophet of the Holy War, along with another leader of the poor, a knight named William the Carpenter, attempted to flee the camp. This was an unheard-of betrayal. The fugitives were caught by a patrol of the Norman Prince Tancred. They were brought back to the camp in disgrace. Tancred forced Peter to publicly swear that he would never again leave the army until Jerusalem. This episode is a vivid testimony to the deep human crisis that Peter was experiencing. It shows that even the most fervent prophet could break under the weight of circumstances. Moreover, the atmosphere in the camp was poisoned not only by hunger, but also by the toxic ambitions of the leaders. After the capture of Antioch, the crusade was stalled for a long time. The reason was simple. The princes could not divide the spoils. Bohemond of Taranto, whose men and cunning had played a key role in taking the city, immediately declared Antioch his own possession, violating the oath given to Emperor Alexios to return all reconquered lands to Byzantium. This enraged Raymond of Toulouse, the richest and most influential of the princes, who himself aimed to be the leader of the crusade and saw Bohemond as a dangerous rival. While the leaders bickered, the ordinary pilgrims, whose only goal was Jerusalem, were dying of disease and grumbling. It was in this atmosphere of cynicism and discord that the miracle of the discovery of the Holy Lance occurred. After the Crusaders, thanks to the betrayal of one of the defenders, finally broke into Antioch, they found themselves trapped. A huge army of the Emir of Mosul, Kerboga, approached the city and besieged them. Now the victors themselves were in the position of the besieged, suffering from a terrible famine. At this moment of despair, a miracle occurred in the city. A certain Provençal peasant named Peter Bartholomew claimed that St. Andrew had appeared to him in visions and revealed the location in the church of St. Peter, where the Holy Lance, the very one with which a Roman legionary had pierced the side of the crucified Christ, was buried. The lance was indeed found. Historians still debate whether it was a brilliant hoax or a matter of sincere faith, but the effect was astonishing. The discovery of the great relic caused an incredible surge of morale in the starving army. However, the discovery did not unite but almost split the Crusader camp. The papal legate Adhemar of Montiel and his circle treated it with extreme skepticism, considering Peter Bartholomew a fraud. But Bohemond of Taranto, who wanted to secure his power in Antioch, immediately became the main champion of the relic's authenticity. The miracle turned into an instrument of political struggle between the Norman and Provençal factions in the army. This feud over the holy object would smolder until the very end of the crusade. And it was Peter the Hermit who, along with another priest, was chosen by the leaders of the crusade to go as an envoy to Kerboga's camp. He was to deliver an ultimatum to the emir: either he retreats or the matter is decided by single combat. Kerboga, of course, only laughed at the ragged envoys. But this mission itself restored some of Peter's former status. And when the Crusaders, inspired by the lance, made a desperate sally and utterly defeated Kerboga's numerically superior army, it was seen as direct divine intervention. Peter was once again at the center of events. After the arduous victory at Antioch, the way to Jerusalem was open. The army, depleted by battles, famine, and disease, moved south, towards the main goal of their crusade. Peter the Hermit's role in this final stage was modest but symbolic. He no longer tried to influence military decisions, leaving that to the princes. His mission became the spiritual care of the army. In early June 1099, the Crusaders finally saw before them the walls of the Holy City. The moment was incredibly emotional. The warriors, who had traveled thousands of kilometers and endured unimaginable suffering, wept, fell to their knees, and kissed the ground. But Jerusalem, under the rule of the Egyptian Fatimids, was well fortified and ready for defense. The final decisive siege began. During the siege, when the first assault failed and despondency began to grow in the camp again, it was Peter the Hermit who became one of the main organizers of a penitential procession. On July 8th, 1099, the barefoot crusaders, priests and warriors led by Peter and other clergy with crosses and banners circled the walls of Jerusalem. They sang psalms and prayed. On the Mount of Olives, a place sacred to every Christian, Peter delivered one of his most fiery sermons, calling the warriors to unity and a final effort in the name of the Lord. This act of collective penance and prayer, the participants believed, purified the army and restored divine favor to it. A week later, on July 15th, 1099, the Crusaders launched a general assault. After a fierce battle, they managed to break into the city. The breakthrough was achieved largely thanks to two giant siege towers, which the Crusaders had built with great difficulty under the leadership of Godfrey of Bouillon and Raymond of Toulouse. Wood for their construction was catastrophically scarce in the scorched surroundings of Jerusalem and had to be brought from the forests of Samaria, dozens of kilometers away. From one of these towers, brought up to the wall in the northeast, Godfrey's warriors threw down a bridge and were the first to step onto the wall. What followed became another bloody and shameful page in the history of the Crusade. Seized with fury and a thirst for revenge, the victors carried out a monstrous massacre in the city, killing Muslims and Jews, men, women, and children. The chroniclers describe with horror and at the same time with triumph how the streets of the city were ankle-deep in blood, and at the Temple of Solomon it was up to the horses' knees. We do not know how Peter the Hermit behaved during these events. Most likely he, like the other priests, went to the main shrine, the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, to offer a prayer of thanksgiving. For him, this was a moment of supreme triumph. The goal for which he had raised nations, for which tens of thousands of his followers had died, was achieved. The holy site was liberated. His personal mission, received as he believed from Christ himself, was fulfilled. After the capture of Jerusalem and the founding of the Kingdom of Jerusalem, most of the Crusaders considered their vow fulfilled and began to prepare to go home. Among them was Peter. At the end of 1099 or early 1100, he boarded a ship in a Syrian port and set off back to Europe. His great adventure had come to an end. Peter the Hermit's return to Europe was not triumphant. The glory of the main hero conquerors went to Godfrey of Bouillon, who became the first ruler of Jerusalem, Bohemond, who founded the Principality of Antioch, and other noble lords. Peter, having fulfilled his vow, returned to where he had started, the life of an ascetic. He arrived in his native region, Picardy. Here, in the town of Huy, in modern-day Belgium, he founded an Augustinian monastery, Neuf-Moustiers. He became its prior and spent the rest of his life in prayer and penance. He died, according to various sources, in 1115 or 1131 and was buried in the monastery he had founded. But if his earthly life ended quietly and unnoticed, his posthumous fame, his myth, was just beginning to grow. In the following decades and centuries, his figure became rapidly mythologized. In popular memory and in the works of many chroniclers, especially those who wrote after the events. It was Peter the Hermit, not Pope Urban II, who came to be considered the main and sole initiator of the First Crusade. The speech at Clermont was attributed to him. The legend of his vision in Jerusalem became the accepted version. He was transformed into an epic hero, a holy prophet who, by the power of his word alone, had raised the Christian world for a holy war. This image existed in European culture for many centuries, right up to the Enlightenment and the development of critical historical science. Modern historiography, of course, has debunked this myth. Today, historians agree that the key figure, the organizer and ideologue of the First Crusade, was Pope Urban II, who was pursuing his own complex political and ecclesiastical goals. Peter's role was different but no less important. He was not a strategist but a catalyst. He was a brilliant populist who was able to translate a complex idea into a language understandable to the masses. He became the voice and leader of the other crusade, the spontaneous, popular, fanatical movement that anticipated and, perhaps, in some ways even spurred on the crusade of the feudal lords. So who was he, this man who left such a deep and controversial mark on history? A saint who heard the voice of God, a charismatic demagogue who manipulated the feelings of the crowd, a madman obsessed with a fixed idea, or simply a man of his time who embodied to the extreme all its contradictions, fervent faith and blind fanaticism, a thirst for spiritual podvik and a readiness for monstrous cruelty? Probably he was a little of everything. His story is an eternal reminder of the power of word and faith, capable of moving mountains and nations, but it is also a dire warning of what this power can turn into when it is not restrained by reason, compassion, and responsibility. Peter the Hermit wanted to liberate one tomb, but in the process he opened a Pandora's box, releasing the demons of religious intolerance, mass violence, and xenophobia that would torment Europe and the world for many centuries to come. He stands at the beginning of the long and bloody history of the Crusades, a grandiose epic of the clash of civilizations that changed both the West and the East. And at the very beginning of this path, riding his simple donkey in a dusty tunic, stands the solitary and eternally enigmatic figure of the prophet from Amiens, a man who believed that God spoke to him and made half the world believe it too, a man whose name is forever inscribed in history with fire, blood, and tears. Thank you for spending this time with us, delving into the depths of history. If you enjoyed this journey, please subscribe to our channel so you don't miss new, exciting stories. Your support helps us create new episodes. Until next time.